Let's welcome the moderator, In Kyung Chang.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope you are refreshed after a whole day of listening to all these fantastic examples and philosophical insights. And it's too much to comprehend in one group. But today's last session, but not least, I'm going to introduce Professor Lee Hyun-kyung from Seo University of Seoul, Korea. I think she's up and coming, very active researcher, especially on, let's speak, dark heritage, difficult heritage. So she's going to speak about maybe we are talking about decolonization or maybe pre-colonization legacy. So how that her research will give us insights on the development of the dark heritage-based museums. Unfortunately, she could not make it here, but she sent us recordings, and I understand that she is waiting for us after hearing her video. You can talk to her directly and virtually. So could you show us Professor Lee's presentation? Could you give us a big round of applause for her speech?
I'm Hyun-kyung Lee and work as an assistant professor at Critical Global Studies Institute, Seo University in Seoul, South Korea. I'm so honored and pleased to participate in the ICOM IMREC Decolonialization Expert Seminar, Museums, Decolonialization, Restitute, a Global Conversation. In particular, I would like to express my great gratitude to Dr. Carol Scott for her generosity and warm support, as well as Dr. Jang In-kyung, who recommended me to this meaningful event and is going to give me comments as a discussant. Today, I would like to give you my paper, Asia's Difficult Heritage Making Between Nationalism and Transnationalism, with the three colonial prism-turned museums in China, South Korea, and Taiwan, China. I have been working on Asia's difficult heritage for the last 10 years and published two monographs, Difficult Heritage and Nation Building, by focusing on Japanese colonial architectural heritage in South Korea, and Heritage, Memory, and Punishment, with a case of colonial prisons in East Asia. As an editor and chapter contributor, I participated in the book project and the edited volume Frontiers of Memory in the Asia-Pacific, Difficult Heritage and the Transnational Politics of Post-Colonial Nationalism. By discussing whether Asia's difficult heritage is either a troublemaker or peacemaker, I have examined colonial heritage and Cold War heritage in East Asia, difficult heritage interpretation and peace building at UNESCO, and transnational difficult heritage network in Asia. Then what is difficult heritage? Difficult heritage can be understood in two different contexts. First, places associated with a traumatic historic events, and second, places have diverse perspectives and interpretations due to traumatic historic events, and they lead to political dissonance and memory conflicts that affect the formation of identity, such as the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland and the Hiroshima atomic bombing dome in Japan. Asia's difficult heritage has been dealt with in the context of nationalism. However, I relocate difficult heritage in between nationalism and transnationalism, reflecting my second book project. I have chosen colonial prisons in Asia as difficult heritage. I would like to perceive colonial prisons as modern prisons in the context of world penal history, colonial products in the context of colonialism, and difficult heritage in the context of post-colonial heritage management. Therefore, I have taken 3 cases for the colonial prison in Asia, Lushin Luso-Japanese prison in China, Sodaemun prison in South Korea, and Jiayi Old prison in Taiwan, China. 3 of them were constructed by Japanese imperial authorities. First, I will examine the birth of 3 colonial prisons during the colonial period. Next, I will investigate how the difficult past has been heritized in 3 different places. Then, on the basis of different perceptions on the Japanese colonial period, I will analyze how 3 colonial prisons have transformed into 3 museums during the post-colonial period. Hence, this is a transnational comparative study of decommissioned post-colonial prisons in Seoul, Lushun, Jiayi, in order to understand the role of difficult heritage between nationalism and transnationalism. Shall we start with the 3 questions in order to understand why East Asia's colonial prisons are both modern and colonial products, and how Western penal reforms were linked to East Asia's colonial prisons? First, by examining the Western penal reform in the 18th century, we consider how the changing thinking of the punishment embodied in the architectural style and structure of modern prisons. Second, what did Meiji Japan learn from the Western penal system and practices during Meiji Japan's penal reform in the late 19th century? Third, how were the Japan's learnings employed in East Asia's colonial prisons design and structure during the early 20th century? The Western penal reform brought about sensational changes of punishment that consequently affected the concept of the prison. Before the penal reform, people were punished through torture. That means inflicting pain was the main focus. Hence, the prison functioned as a short detention that was simply to hold inmates securely. But after the penal reform, the definition of punishment was changed to deprivation of the liberty of movement for education. The one penal reformer group, penal reformer John Howard, and the Quakers argued that education was needed in order to reconcile the broken relationship with God, as they believed that human beings' wrongdoing stemmed from the broken relationship with God. In order to help people strengthen the one-to-one relationship with God, solitary confinement was emphasized and the Pennsylvania system was adopted. The other penal reform group, Cassera Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham, argued that education was needed in order to reach restorative justice for the society. By emphasizing the discipline, labor in silence was considered to be the most important punishment, and it was adopted to the urban system in New York. Both groups argued to facilitate easier surveillance and a program of correction. Considering all the values of punishment, Jeremy Bentham created the panopticon structure that can be applied to prisons, factories, and mental hospitals. As you can see the image in the middle of the slide, one warden is able to watch over many inmates, more than 10. Hence, the panopticon provided an effective management system. After Japan joined the imperialism as a latecomer, Meiji Japan made an effort to create Imperial Japan's penal reform system that could be employed to both the nation and its colonies. Meiji Japan sent Japanese scholars to the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore and to Europe, and they learned about modern prison system architectural designs. Ohara Shigekana and Yamashita Geiziro were two main figures in Meiji Japan's penal reform. You can see some examples that Meiji penal reforms were applied to Japanese modern prisons, such as Nara prison in Japan, radial structure that would be a variation of panopticon structure, and red bricks, as you can see two photos. Kanazawa prison in Japan is also red brick and radial structure like Nara cases. Then how about Japanese colonial prisons? They were similar in structure and designs to Nara and Kanazawa prisons, combining Pennsylvania system, solitary confinement, urban system, labor, and pentombil structure, panopticon. The Japanese colonial prisons aim to not only correct colonial prisoners into obedient and dutiful subjects to an imperial community, but also exhibit and project a positive image of Imperial Japan to Western countries in order to prove how Japan's colonial rule was civilized. Let me walk you through each case. The first case is Sodemen Prison in Seoul. Sodemen Prison was constructed in 1907 and opened in 1908 and used as a colonial prison until liberation from Japan in 1945. Excuse me. It is known that many Korean independent activists were imprisoned. After liberation, it was still reused as a prison during the post-colonial period. Many political prisoners related to the democracy movement were imprisoned in this prison. When this was moved to Uwang City in 1987, due to its deterioration, this site was converted into Sodemen Prison History Hall, Museum, and Independent Park to commemorate Korean independence activists. The second case is Lushin Russo-Japanese prison. The Lushin Russo-Japanese prison witnessed how the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War contributed to the colonization of Dali and Lushin, and by extension to the colonization of Korea in the first half of the 20th century. Lushin prison was built and managed by Russian authorities between 1902 and 1906. And after the defeat of the Russian Empire in 1905, Japan took control over Lushin, and the Japanese colonial administration started to use the Lushin prison and remained it as prison agency Kanto administration. Could you please see the photo at the lower left-hand side of the slide? The white buildings were the parts constructed by the Russian authorities, and the red buildings were the parts built by the Japanese authorities. From 1945 to 1955, this area was occupied by the Rujun naval base, and this prison site was used as a housing from 1955 to 1970. Due to the 1969 Zangbao Island incident, the Chinese Communist Party decided to use the defunct prison as evidence of war crimes and as material propaganda to mobilize and organize both anti-Russian and anti-Japanese sentiment. After the restoration process during the 1970 and 1971, from 1971, this prison site was used as the Lushin Russo-Japanese Prison Museum. The third case is the Jiayi prison. The Jiayi prison was constructed in 1919 and it was used as a colonial prison in 1945. It was reused as a prison from 1945 to 1994 and subsequently used as the staff housing from 1994 to 2005. As you can see the photo in the middle of the slide, Jiayi is famous for the Alishan Mountain and the Alishan Railway. In particular, Alishan Railway that was constructed by the Japanese authorities has been considered to be a proud industrial heritage in Taiwan, China, and it is one of the most important tourist attractions. Considering such tourism, this museum was preserved and reopened as a museum of penal affairs managed by the Ministry of Justice from 2005. This museum does not particularly narrate colonial history, but provides a general story of penal affairs that are different from Solomon Prison and Luxin Prison. The current use and interpretation of three colonial prisons are closely depending on how each place perceives the Japanese imperial period after the end of the Second World War, and how each of them builds up their current international relationship with Japan. As both South Korea and China mainly build up the anti-Japanese colonialism in their official narratives, both museums narrate to strengthen the official narratives. For example, Southern Prison and Luxin Prison carried out a transnational UNESCO World Heritage nomination project from 2015 to 2017 by sharing the stories of An Jung-gun, who was the Korean independent activist and was imprisoned and dead in Luxin Prison. However, the changing political climate between Japan, South Korea, China, and US, such as an issue surrounding the THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, ultimately led to the breakdown of collaboration between South Korea and China. This shows the international relationship deeply affected such transnational heritage-making processes. The former Jiayi prison is also used for the educational purposes to help students understand penal structure and the law, but is not closely tied up with the other two cases. Taiwan's position under colonial history is ambiguous in relation to the wide spectrum of pro-Japanese and anti-Japanese sentiments, and the Taiwanese case is not used to generate patriotic anti-Japanese sentiments. This shows that while Asia definitely shares certain colonial experiences and material cultures, each Asian region has its own distinctive perspectives and responses to their colonial legacies. As seen in three cases, if you examine the colonial prisons by focusing on only colonial past, each prison history can be trapped into the rigid political frame of nationalism. In order to overcome this, it is also important to understand them in the transnational context. We tend to comprehend them as educational materials, but we need to relocate them in a shared material culture as modern and colonial products. Such difficult heritage sites are easily politicized, and these prison-turned museum sites are abused to preach for each nation's political purposes. In order to achieve a genuinely shared memory rather than a common memory made up of assorted aggregates, communication is essential for opening up the process of remembering to a multitude of voices. Instead of indoctrination, by pointing to the transnational shared nature of these penal heritage museums, we hope that penal heritage, as heritage shared across borders, can be constantly revisited and remade in ways that open up communication about human pain and difficult memories in the service of conciliation rather than rivalry. It is all that I have prepared. Any comments and feedback are more than welcome. In addition, I'd like to learn more about global perspectives on museums, decolonialization, and restitution from all of you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Lee. She really mentioned the sensitive issues that remind me of 2017 International Museum Day theme, contested history, speakable and unspeakable. I remember if I write it correctly. So we had at museum, yes, museums and contested histories, say the unspeakable in museums. So maybe she mentioned that it's connected with that. Thank you so much. It's not really museum itself, but you researched pre-museum history. So we have the context of those immovable heritage, difficult heritage. But could you give us more? I don't know how your research proceeded, but after the thought, and is there any movement among them, or just beyond only 3 of them, but more museums working together or try to work together?
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I'm not in person at the moment, but yes, thank you very much for your question. In 2018 and in 2019, and Southern Prison History Hall organized some academic workshop to invite the museum curators from Abashiri Prison Turned Museum in Japan, and also the Jai Old Prison from Taiwan, China, and also I also represent one of the prison experts, prison term museum experts. So we exchanged how the prison turned museum should work together to understand the transnational way on the material culture, and also how they treated inmates in the prison turned museums. Actually, the many prisons in colonial prisons are turned into the hotel or some entertainments. But at the moment, some prisons made an effort to keep it as a museums to provide some historical evidences. But unfortunately, after 2017, Southern Prison History Hall in South Korea and Rushin Museum in China doesn't seem to have a further exchange each other. So that is a bit sad news.
Yeah, thank you. Having a difficult heritage and has historical evidence is one thing, but here we are talking about decolonization. Because of these prisons played a very important role in brainwashing the prisoners and colonies. So, but they have to play a role in see the culture in new lights. Did you see any movement on that instead of just getting together as a panel system?
Dr. Ingyong, could you please could you repeat again, because it's like a little bit harder to yes, the sounds was a bit
Sure.
not very clear enough.
Yes, what I understand from your example is that they got together as a prison museums with a historical evidence, with a difficult heritage. But we are talking about here with the decolonization context. So do they have any, instead of just showing the panel system and how it is used, or how it was based, how it was explaining the architecture, but how they can play the role to decolonizing the mental state of the people who were colonists and also colonizers.
I'm not sure whether I understand right clearly about your question, but I do my best to respond to your question. So the prison, as you mentioned, that like prisons as a prison turned museums is provide like a very significant historical evidence. But as I mentioned before, that each prison history hall just operated by in the strong national narrative. So is necessary to expand to understand that kinds of the architectural style and material cultures and how the colonizers brainwashed that inmates clearly. But now they just seems to just emphasize and how the prisoners were just suffered from the aggressive colonizers from Japan. So that prison history, each prison turned museums tended to provide the kinds of some anti-Japanese narratives at the moment in their history events. But Jai prison is provide some general like perspectives on the how the prison was operated, how the Taiwan, China, like deal with the prisoners in their own country. So that is a little bit different operation, but anyway, each museum just like a track into the national narratives and rather than transnational networking or in the understanding in the wider context.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a wise answer to my stupid question, because for me that it's very the anti-Japanese movement is still very strong in this East Asian context. I'm sure, maybe Pacific region, that I don't know the specific examples. So for us, the colonization is that it's not reconciled. That they have to the colonizers have to repent. So it's a totally different way of approaching it. So doing these things in a museum context still needs a lot of conversation, like today's subject. So maybe because the prison turned museum is a real hard evidence of that we were colonized. So it's very painful for us just looking at it. From my personal experience, I went to Sadaemun Hyungwoo Museum. It got just getting into the door gives me a chill, and you just don't want to talk about it. It's just very painful. So that was my personal experience. So maybe we don't really get into that decolonization steps before it takes time, more conversation. Anybody, Professor Lee, you want to add something on my comments, or if you want to add something to your lecture?
Yeah, I agree with Ingyong. Actually, it's like when I enter the Lushan prison in China, I also feel very chilled as I had the same feeling in a Southern Prison History Hall. But I'd like to say one more thing because because of the limit of time, I just only focuses on the connection with the colonial period. But the as I mentioned before in the presentation, each three prison-turned museums are reused as the prisons or some certain other uses during the post-colonial period. But the memories and stories of the post-colonial memories during the post-colonial period in the three museums seems to be erased because it's like in order to make some strong national narratives, they don't want to make a more complicated one. So I think it's a time to think about how we can embrace the decolonization and as well as the new narratives inscribed during the post-colonial period. So that is my one of the like addition in order to overcome that kinds of the colonial complexes happening in East Asia.
Thank you very much. That was a very good point. There's another history after that, but it's erased to emphasize the previous history. That's very interesting. Any comments and questions from? Oh yes.
I am Emma Nardi from Italy, and I compliment you about your presentation, who is so well grounded that you have a solid education, even in the philosophical field. My question is, this kind of museum could be very useful from the educational point of view. There are so many different violent stories to be told. Can you quote to us some educational program that you address in these museums, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful question. As far as I know, and then Sodom Prison History Hall, and Rushin Prison, and Jai Prison. Three prisons provide an interesting educational program. And meanwhile, they also provide guided tour, uh, including English guided tour. But Sodom Prison History Hall and Rushin Prison History Hall tended to focus on the national history relating to Japan, but Jai Prison also provide an educational program to understand the general law system in Taiwan, China, rather than relating to colonial period. So definitely three museums are used as educational purposes, but they also differently located in a different system. But Southern Prison Historial and Rushin Prison is a kind of mandated school trips courses to promote students to come to the museum to understand colonial era.
Uh, okay. Professor Lee, my name is Kidong Bae, as I'm Korean. So before you start your presentation, I decided not to ask any questions to your presentation because me Korean and the moderator Korean and the presentator Korean. But your presentation is so, giving some diverse thinking about decolonizations. So up to now, is most of the presentation was focused on the the items object, but this one is a site. So kind of it your presentation widen our perspectives of our thinking about the decolonizations. The yeah, I would like gently ask you some, your thinking is right now is, the Korean government and the Japanese government, they have some different opinions about World Heritage site in Japan, in Kyushu, Battleship Island. So in doing such a site or prison into the museum or some public place for the our humans past heritages. So the important aspect of that process is interpretations. So different people, different country, or different sector of society, they may have different diverse interpretations. So yeah, we have some site. We would like to have a museum. So we put a museum. In the museum, there are some contents, history of the site and the all kind of the event or the archives. What we have could be a source for the contents of the site, and also the contents could have been interpreted by the some people from the different culture. So what do you think about? Yeah. Just frankly, your opinion, because you are. I'm. Uh, I'm sorry. I raised some ages, but my father's generation and my generation and your generation may have a quite different the view about colonizations. So I would like to know about your current thinking about the interpretation of the colonial sites and the museum, prison as a museum for our generations. Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much for thought-provoking questions, and also I'm so honored to get the question from Professor Pegidong, who I admire for a long time, and thank you very much. Yes, it's like a heritage interpretation is a very important issue. I would like to say that um, I think it's very important to say that prison turns museum have two different functions as like considering major industrial heritage sites and in the World Heritage Sites, there is a very big debate, as you know, is the Japan perceive it as a first industrial sites in Asia as a glorious past, but the other one is like perceived as a Taiwan, China, and North Korea and South Korea perceived it as the sites of the forced labor camp as a very dark side of the history. I think it's like a heritage site has a very much various layers of history, and the prison turned museum also have that. So it's like I think it's like from my point of view, that is a very important thing to show the diverse interpretations in considering the process of the time. So not only, of course, each site might have a very main narratives, but we needed to be very carefully listen to the marginalized voices as well. So Southern Prison History Hall has some significant movement to see that instead of just emphasizing the torture, but torture happening during the colonial period, but they really focused on how the independent activists lived in the Southern Prison History Hall. They suffered, but meanwhile, they made an effort to overcome that kinds of difficult period in prison. So I think it's like, I'm not sure, but nationalistic view and then kinds of nationalistic views like our heritage is the best in the world instead of that kinds of the nationalistic view, but we can perceive that Southern Prison History Hall, very significant Korean history in the wider context of the colonial history, and then the Southern Prison History Hall also contributes to the East Asian colonial history. So I don't know whether my answer is rightly answered your responses, but actually it's like I'm Korean and also I love Korean as well and history, but Southern Prison History Hall made an effort to expand the not only the very much nationalist view, but meanwhile the many people's efforts to live there. So like people's voices to overcome that colonial period is also very important from my point of view. But yes, I hope that this is like my answer is response to your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor Lee. I think that really explained that instead of having the reconciliation is not from outside, it's from inside. I think that's very important point you made, from inside. And the colonization is from inside, not from someone else is giving us. Professor Anlaishan, yes, please.
李教授您好，我们这次会议的工作语言是英语和汉语，我想用汉语向您提出一个问题。Can you hear me, Professor
Could
Lee?
you use the translation, Professor Lee? Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Thank you. 我的问题呢，实际上重复了刚才张仁清教授提到的2017年的时候，国际博物馆日的主题是不可言说的历史。那么，不可言说的历史其实包括了很多不同的方面。有的历史是人们不愿意去触碰的，不愿意去触碰到这样的创伤。有的历史是博物馆或者相关的机构有意要回避的。有的历史是由于人们还没有意识到它是个不可言说的历史，所以才不去讲述。所以当讲述不可言说的历史的时候，其实它所包含的内容是非常广泛的。 涉及到困难遗址，我觉得它不应该，所以博物馆这个公共机构，它不应该是一个简单的一个制造仇恨的地方。但如果是说，我们假设一下，如果有一些历史，它本身是不可言说，而这种不可言说的这部分内容，又被曾经的殖民者把握了话语权的话，我们在这个前提之下来谈和解，是不是有些过于乌托邦的想法？谢谢您。
Thank you very much for your question. I don't think, sorry, uh, I think it's like that is a very good point. And then I would like to say that difficult heritage has been perceived as a troublemaker in many countries because the difficult heritage also generate like a hatred or kinds of conflicts between diverse stakeholders depending on their perception. However, I would like to say that difficult heritage is not a troublemaker, but a peacemaker to open up the discussion. Then we can know how we have a different opinions. So it's like that is like a peaceful moments at the surface. It doesn't seem to work properly, but that kinds of we open up the discussion more widely and we can see how we differently think, then that is the first step to go forward for the reconciliation. And I'd like to say that it's like if we just focusing on yes, definitely it's like that heritage sites can be very easily politicized and also weaponized to attack the other side. However, heritage sites is still very strong as a historic evidence, and meanwhile, is the place of many people's having a many people's stories. So once we start to listen to the many people's stories, not on the national level but also individual level, then heritage has become a strong power to communicate each other. So I think that is the first step of the decolonization from my point of view. I'm also very idealistic though. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Oh, when I said reconciliation, not between the nations, it's just personal reconciliation about the situation. Because even though I didn't live that age, I still feel the pain. So I need reconciliation of that period, even though I didn't really experience it. It's a national legacy somehow. So that's what I meant, not as a nation to nation. Unfortunately, the time is up. So thank you, Professor Yi. I hope I can see you in Seoul someday.
Thank you.
And
Sure.
thank you so much for a very important and sharp questions and comments. And now our academic director, Carol Scott, will come and synthesize today's presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.